Thank you very much for that introduction, and I guess it's really pertinent to be following James because some of the things that I wanted to refer to in terms of some of the possibilities are certainly some of those aspects. When I thought about designing education futures, I was really targeting the fact that one of the key themes of this conference is around the concept of design. And I thought, from the little bit I know of design, certainly an end user experience is one of the key components of that. But I guess getting it right in terms of what it is that you want the thing to do is also part of that. So I thought I'd start by reflecting on the efficacy of past education design. And by this, I'm really thinking more about formal education settings, and I'm actually going to focus in on schools in particular, because I think that's often an area that we don't necessarily get enough context around in some of these sorts of gatherings. And in terms of thinking about that, I thought, well, if one of the aims of education is to basically provide skills, knowledge, attitudes and things that in some way or another influence social behaviour, then perhaps an anecdote I could think about was the fact that when I first started teaching, we're going back now to the late 70s, that was the first year that schools were able to order garbage bins from government stores and have them delivered painted in bright green with stickers on them that said, "Do the right thing." That was the start of the public education campaigns where we thought that we would actually be able to change social behaviour by going on and on about value propositions, about keeping playgrounds clean and things like that. And we went through the Don't Be a Tosser campaign and all of those things. A couple of years ago, I went down to Throsby Creek near where I live and saw that particular site. And I looked and thought, yeah, okay, we've done some great things to that particular waterway over the years. But after a big rainstorm, we still had all of that stuff washing down the creek. And it made me think, you know, if the education over that 35-year period had been so successful in actually building a sustained shift in values, then perhaps we'd be seeing something other than that. And I thought of the idea of what happens when we go to the standard Macca's car park and look around and see what actually happens in terms of behaviour. In other words, I guess it made me think that what we're actually doing in terms of saying we're going to teach kids this in school because it's going to lead to an improvement in a social behaviour outcome, is it actually happening? Or is it actually seen by the people who are there as some sort of parallel universe? And that what actually happens in that place isn't actually what happens in the real world. So that's one of my fundamental premises. And from that point of view, why do we actually have schools? Why do we have this bricks and mortar place called a school that we actually compel kids to go to for 13, in most cases, years of the most formative stage of their life? And the common answers that come to that would be probably around things like socialisation, learning skills, all of those sorts of things. I'm trying to actually get my slide to go on there. But, you know, one of those common things, apart from the cynical perspective, is, well, it's a childminding service that enables me to go out and do the stuff I want to do. But apart from that, and apart from the other things about learning things that I'll get to in a moment, is certainly around that socialisation agenda. You know, learning to actually acknowledge the fact that we can't always have our own way, that we need to get on with other people, that we actually live in a community where there are people who are different and things like that. And basically, little kids are very good at understanding that individual differences don't necessarily separate us. And they're actually very, very good at participating in programs at school level around anti-racism and anti-bullying and all of those other sorts of things, which makes it curious that earlier this year, when Adam Goodes was actually targeted by a young spectator in the audience, the response of the New South Wales government was to reissue the anti-racism material. In other words, all we need to do as a panacea to some sort of ill is to actually reissue the educative material that's going to make the difference. The problem, of course, is it's demonstrably not necessarily happening, because I think in growing terms, so many of our kids feel like they're actually parked in a parallel universe. They're aware of the possibilities that are out there and that we see and we've seen over these couple of days, but their schooling experience doesn't necessarily reflect that. It's basically a place where, in some cases, they check their particular passion at the door when they come in. Is that really good enough? So if school's about socialisation, is it also then about, and this is the big one that people would often talk about, or is it about winning the education race? And right around the world at the moment, we've got countries that are getting really, really worried about the international rankings in PISA, the test that's conducted for 15-year-olds. And we've had in the US the No Child Left Behind. And I'm not bagging these programs necessarily because they have actually provided funding for a whole range of things, followed up by the Race to the Top program. But here in Australia, we get the constant rhetoric about the fact that we need to be in the top 5. That's our big aim. What will happen when we get there? You know, does everybody win a toffee apple for being part of the winning race? What is it that we actually want out of that particular process? Is it about simply setting kids up so that they actually learn the skills and knowledge required to get a job? Because that's certainly been touted as part of the entry and exit process of an educative and certainly a school process. Is it about getting that career, getting the best job possible? Well, there's a whole bundle of kids out there at the moment who are actually engaged very, very heavily in that right at the moment. Because coming up in a week or so here in New South Wales, we will have thousands of students right across the state crammed into school halls, sitting down at desks like that and writing longhand for up to 3 hours in some cases to actually attain some form of qualification based on a set of criteria which have been outlined for them as an exit outcome of that 13 years previous experience. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't recall the last time I actually wrote something for 3 hours longhand. And if there's stress around the examination process, maybe it's got as much to do with that as anything else. And yet we basically accept the premise that we're going to chug on through that whole system, and at the end of it, we're actually going to make a decision about the future prospects of someone based on that one particular event. And we've all done it. But is it actually leading to this situation? You know, here during this particular festival and in their previous intake, we've got an example here in Newcastle of the Slingshot program where tenacious entrepreneurs turn killer ideas into remarkable companies. I suspect that those ideas and the tenacious entrepreneurship doesn't necessarily come from cramming for an external examination. It comes from a whole bundle of characteristics which are probably a lot more inherent than that. Looking for a job is held up as one of the exit outcomes of a formal education system, and yet people have a view in their mind of what the world of work might look like. And the reality is that workplaces are probably looking a whole lot different these days, and a lot of you people would probably be much more aware of that than me. But, you know, thinking about just even the change from the sitting down behind the desk to standing up to actually interfacing with people using Skype or whatever else across the world, across the room, across the suburb. That's from the offices of Airbnb in San Francisco, where people also on certain days of the week take their pets to work. You know, we've got a really shifting paradigm in the way that the world of work looks. We've got companies who understand that their people are engaged and connected to each other, not just in their workplace, but by the whole world of social media. And we've also got examples right here in Newcastle of things like, you know, shared co-working spaces. And there are plenty of examples like this up in the West End and down here, downtown, and right around the countryside and right around the globe of varying degrees of sophistication or whatever. But the world of work as a preparation process is looking very, very different these days for our kids. Millions of people around the world tune into the TED Talks and see people like Sir Ken Robinson talk about, you know, changing the education paradigm, about the need to build creativity, about the need to raise the dormant bits of passion that are there amongst our kids and to actually let it surface and emerge in meaningful ways. And you can hear the audience clap as each of these things are examined. People like Siddhartha Mitra, who was the TED Prize winner last year, or this year rather, talks about, you know, self-organised learning environments, setting up schools in the cloud, the fact that we want to build away from what was the factory model of schooling. You know, mass schooling was fundamentally set up at the time as the Industrial Revolution pointed up the need for us to develop systems where we were able to develop people who understood simple values like turning up to work on time, who had basic levels of literacy and numeracy to be able to actually complete the tasks required of them and to participate in that level of society. And we've fundamentally maintained that model right the way through. And we're still, to a certain extent, stuck in that. But we've got plenty of people talking about the need to change, but we're not necessarily seeing that actually translate into what actually happens. Despite rapid social change then, if we actually look at what the common social icons are around what schools look like, What better way to do that than to just do a simple Google search on Google Images? And if we type in the word school up the top and hit enter, that these days is still the common view that we have of what a school experience or a school might look like. Right across the USA, for example, at the moment, they're actually talking about lots of changes in the way that they do schooling, but they still send their kids to school in a big yellow bus that looks pretty much the same way as it has ever since we've seen them in movies for over 50 years. We still have this view of school basically that it's a place where teachers stand at the front of the room and it's about power and it's about control and it's about developing compliant attitudes. In some ways, whether we verbalise it that way or not, that's some of the dominant paradigm that actually sits there. Teachers and people who work in formal education are caught in this world where there's a dichotomy of expectation. Now, on the one hand, we talk about the beauty of uniqueness, of encouraging people to be different, encouraging people to connect with their passions and their individuality. We talk about that sense of finding the bit that makes you different and makes you stand out. Thinking about how you're actually going to harness that to be able to go through a process perhaps of trying a whole lot of ideas and eventually finding that killer company or the idea that actually makes it stick. We talk about the need to treat individual learners in individual ways and differentiate the instruction because people understand that no two people are exactly the same. We talk about, one size not fitting all and to make sure that we actually personalise learning and all of those things. And yet, if you go out there in the community and say to people, what do you look at when you're making a decision about what you think is a quality school or what is actually a good school? It often boils down, to just how much all the kids look just like each other. I'm not necessarily bagging out school uniform per se, but it's the principle that sits behind it, that the big tick goes to that quality or that thing that we look at in terms of the level of compliance, the level of willingness to actually subjugate that idea of personal difference into a corporate identity. That means that we all want to be part and proud of that similar thing and that that's okay. And yet somehow or other, it doesn't necessarily sit with the rhetoric that we've been speaking about before. So little wonder that some teachers and certainly lots of kids are very, very confused by that. And particularly kids who don't necessarily feel particularly powerful in a personal sense. Kids who may come from a background where they don't necessarily understand all the finer points of what that particular system is trying to do. And people who have very little power in the rest of their life find that the only power that they sometimes have is the power to basically do that. And the power basically to say, up yours, to a system that they feel absolutely alienated from. And yet some of those people who are doing that may in fact be the people who are able to go and sit in a shed somewhere and design something that is absolutely amazing. Like the guy that was focused on in the Maker Movement presentation yesterday, sitting in a shed in Mexico. Or the people right around the world who are doing things like collaborating with other people online using guitar riffs and programs to be able to actually share that across the world. Some of these people have found that that is their only out. And then the other ones are the ones who actually just tolerate the situation itself. I guess what I'm saying is that we're getting a whole bundle of confusing signals. And it's very, very difficult sometimes to work out what exactly is the way forward. Even here in Australia, with the Australian curriculum, which has been released and adopted over a progressive number of years, in the advertising material, we still come up with the fact that one of the big selling points about this is it's going to be all delivered online so that people access it via devices and so forth. But just in case people thought we were really getting away from the true purpose of things, we make sure that we put it against a backdrop of a blackboard and chalk. I mean, maybe that's a subtle thing, but it really struck me that we still have a ways to go in that we've got to actually hedge our bets. We want to talk about innovation, but we want to make sure that people understand that we're still deadly serious about some of the things that they actually value. Because, to rely too heavily on technology might actually be cheating. Learning how to use biros instead of pencils may mean that we'll lose the skill to actually sharpen them or something like that. People have these fears about moving on. And the current policy paradigm largely is around school planning. In other words, let's take what we know about schools and the view we have in our mind of what a school is and actually plan to make it incrementally better. Nothing particularly wrong with that, but it doesn't actually address the dominant paradigm about what a school actually is. It's about tweaking it, but it doesn't actually go to the core of what is this thing and how could we potentially make it different. If we do this simple little word order shift though, if I could get my clicker to work, we start talking about a very, very different concept. And you know, think about that word order shift to anything that you're thinking about. Actually shift the object of the change around and start talking about planning to do the thing itself differently. And we start then to ask all sorts of questions. Why, what, how, who, with what, for whom, when, why, and how will we know? I mean, we start talking about an active process of actually making a difference and of changing something. And that's a process that we really need to go through, because the one inarguable fact, I think, is that schools are places for learning. And by learning, I don't just mean that learning is a process of having teachers teach you stuff. James gave some examples there of where learning is actually very much self-initiated. But learning is that sense of not just being taught things for the sake of teaching. And it was brought home to me as to what are the decisions we make about that. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to go to New York. Now, I hadn't travelled overseas much at all. I grew up on a wheat and sheep farm up near Tamworth in the northwest. Went to a little one-teacher school with 12 kids in it. And this was my first opportunity to go to the USA, and I was lucky enough to be there on July the 4th. And we went down to the Hudson River and were standing watching the fireworks behind this particular little guy who was sitting on his father's shoulders. And the fireworks were going off, and I was actually responding to just how amazing I thought it was that this was actually possible to do, and that I hadn't imagined at that child's age that I would ever be able to do something like that. And I thought, you know, what will this child need on the 4th of July in another 50 years? How do we actually predict that? How do we actually determine what they are going to need to know? You know, it's got to move beyond just content. It's got to actually start talking about concepts, because the content that might have been required at that stage is now going to be incredibly different. We can't actually predict that amount of time out. It's no longer the idea that we've got to store stuff up for the winter like they do in Canada and right across the top of America in big silos so that we've actually got stuff. You know, all that learning that we did just in case you might need it at some point in the future. And the justification. Why do we need to learn this? Well, there might be a time where you need to know that. That concept, I think, is one that we really need to question and really start thinking about how do we actually then have just-in-time learning as a much more relevant outcome of schooling. I think we've got to think about how we divide that, and there's no question that there are some skills that do need to be developed. You know, kids don't necessarily learn how to read just by osmosis. Nor, perhaps in future, will they necessarily know about how to actually influence what appears on screens in front of them if we don't actually give them access to learning some skills around things like coding or whatever else. They're going to need to learn some skills around how to actually cooperate and collaborate as parts of groups and teams and things like that. That's not necessarily going to be just explicit just by doing it, but it will become more important when we actually integrate those into real-world learning situations. And that's where things like the maker movement is actually influencing lots of schools right across the world. There'll be a maker fair being held in Melbourne this year, and there's certainly a big thing in the States at the moment where kids are reconnecting with the possibility of actually making things, where project-based learning actually starts from the point of thinking about what a driving question might be to drive learning. Studying Romeo and Juliet, for example, and looking at the driving question of how do people make decisions and choices about what they might do in life, and then going back into the text as a way to answer that. We have some schools where they're doing things like a genius hour, you know, hitting into the Dan Pink ideas and things like that around providing time for kids to actually choose something that ignites their own passion, but we're not necessarily systematising it, and we still come back to actually, at the end of it all, testing it all in a final examination. And we've certainly got to provide space in there for recreation in its true sense of recreation. Now, how do we recreate mind, body and soul and spirit? And we don't do it by saying that we don't have enough time for music and art because we're too focused on a test. We only do it by providing space in there to actually enable that sense of human passion and excitement and to build the shared core value that that's actually important to us. Because our world out there is awash with information and ideas and imagery. How do we actually do that? We can learn anywhere, anytime at the moment, even 35,000 feet above the Arizona desert. And that, of course, means that that's a very, very disruptive influence. It provides a disruption in what happens, and for many, many years, people saw that disruption in formal education settings as weapons of mass distraction. And the first impetus was to try and ban it, block it, shut it out. And then once we realised it wasn't going anywhere, we had the digital education revolution and put laptops and things out there and did a lot of stuff that we used to do in other ways before by simply digitising it and putting it available. So the encyclopedia was now available online. Whether that's necessarily fitting into where we really want to go, I'm really not sure. It's all about consuming information. And James spoke about the Khan Academy, which I'm going to come to in a moment, but lots of people are trying this idea of the flipped classroom, of putting the learning online, podcasts and things like that, so that kids can actually access the content at home and then come to school to be able to actually negotiate what their learning is from all of that. And the Khan Academy is certainly a place where the learner is put right in the driving seat. You'll notice these things are all verbs. Watch, practice, learn almost anything. Watch a video, take a challenge, try it now. And I guess the only caution I offer in that sense is that so far as school education goes in particular, we still are living very much in a binary world, that no matter how complex the algorithms, even with the human genome stuff goes, about actually coding information, we're still operating within a binary environment where we only have an on or off, black, white, rights and wrongs and yeses and nos. And within that, we still need the process of understanding that that could in fact narrow our choices. That if it constantly guides us toward just the stuff we like or not like, that perhaps in a learning sense, we may be immune from other possibilities. So the room is really there for people as educators to actually be the human disruptor. To be the person who says, that's fine, here are all the possibilities you've been guided to through that process. What about this idea over here? What about this that sits outside of all of that process? Where do you think that fits? So the role for educators there becomes very much more one of questioning, of being the person who helps people negotiate their learning. We've then got to think about, and I'm not giving a lot of answers here, but I'm asking a lot of questions. What do we actually believe about purpose and progression through this system? Back on the sheep farm that I came from, we used to draft sheep, put them all in at one end, move them through progressively and sort out the ones that go into different paddocks or ones that go to the abattoir at the end. Our schooling system by and large has been like that for many, many years. Put the mob in at one end and sort them out on the way through until the ones that are left go on to do whatever else they're doing, and we test them along the way. I don't have a problem so much with testing, provided it's kept in perspective, provided it's simply a sampling of what actually happens along the way and a way of measuring how well people are going. But we don't need to continue to turn it into an absolute high-stakes process that becomes the be-all and end-all of everything. So if we're going to move from school planning to planning school, who do we actually involve? And I guess, funnily enough, some people are actually twigging to the idea that involving the kids might not be such a bad idea. So we actually have some programs where students are actually driving the design process. And certainly we've got to make sure that we involve parents in that process, because parents of kids about to enter school now are coming from a different generational mindset than that previous. And that's my big call out, I suppose, to say to parents, if you're not happy with what the system itself looks like at the moment, exercise some of the rights that you actually have to be something other than people at an interview which basically says you've got to be this tall to ride this ride. We've got to shift that paradigm as well and say, come around and sit here beside us and let's make some decisions about designing the future for your young people as we go forward. Because they are people who are still innately human. They're innately curious about the world around them. They are still thrilled by natural phenomena that appear different and out there. We're designing systems not for the adults in the process. We're designing an education future for little people who get to grow up to be big people in a world that we've actually created. So we've got to make sure that the curiosity that they have isn't beaten out of them by the time that they get to actually be 5 years old. That they're actually encouraged to question and do all of those things that are so damned annoying sometimes. Because it's not good enough to say that, well, some kids like school, some kids don't school, but it's something you've got to go through to get to the end point to do what you want to do at the end. That concept of it being a rite of passage, I think we can do better than that. And I think that we can expect that we can do better than that. We don't need kids sitting there looking like that as an anticipated outcome of what it is that we do. We want them engaged in learning that really matters. So if we're going to make a race of it, let's make it a race where it's fun, where some people fall down and get up again. Just like the startup culture that says people wear their wounds in San Francisco and Silicon Valley on the basis of how many times they've fallen down and gotten back up again. Why don't we embed that into our way of thinking about learning and make our systems a little more like that as well? But it's not going to happen from the policymaker end. It's going to happen because communities want it that way. So it's something we all have to do. And it's something we need to do right now because it's the future of the kids we're looking at. And the risk of staying the same has actually got to the point where it's greater than the risk to change. Thank you.